Okay, good morning, everyone. What we're going to cover in this lecture, how to do form validations in web servers, okay? There are two types of validations. Usually, there are two types of validations. One of them is that happens on the client, and one of them that happens on the server, okay? So far, everything that we've learned in this course talks about the client side. Now, in the client side, what we have learned, we've learned HTML, we've learned CSS, we've learned JavaScript. Okay, that all happens on the client side. Okay, and then usually you have a form, and that form, like if you want to do user registration or you're trying to list orders, usually when you click on the form, this form goes to the server. Like let's say user registration, it goes to the server. And the server can do some validation also and send you back some feedback, all right? Now, our focus is how do you do the validation here first. Later on in the next lecture, we'll talk to you about how we do validation on this side. Now, to do the validation on this side, there is two parts you can do. You can do either HTML5 validation or you can do JavaScript validation. Okay, it's up to you how you do that. So we're going to talk about those two parts, how we do the JavaScript and how we do the HTML validation. All right. So we have a file that you're going to be, I'll put the link in the YouTube so you can download it from GitHub. We have a file that is called, this small file just has small JavaScript, it has a form, it has 3 fields. They're all text fields. And we have a field here where we're going to display the output, whether the result or whether it is just a message, an error message, okay? And then we have a script. We don't have any script right now, but we will do the script in a minute. All right. If you open this in the browser, this is how this page look like. We have an owner name, we have a room width, a room length, and then you're supposed to enter numbers here and enter a text here. And when you click on the area, it's supposed to validate the information. All right? All right, so that's what we're going to do. Here we have a text, there's a P tag here, a paragraph tag that would display the errors. All right? Right now it doesn't do anything. So let's take a look at this file. First, we will talk about how we do validation using HTML5 keywords, okay? For example, you can say here, first of all, do you see this form? This is form, and then we have an action. The action usually is the page of the server that you're going to go to. So if everything is valid, so if this could be, for example, area.asp, for example, okay? And that could be just a page on a server. Because we're doing it on the client and we don't have a server, I'm not gonna include it. It'll send you back to the same form, all right? So I'm not gonna put anything here. But usually, if the form is valid, it will take you, it send you to the server to this page, okay? But we don't have a page in this case. All right, so I'm gonna leave it as blank. Now, the owner name, these are text field, but we have a button here that's called submit. That button, the type of it is because the type is button now, is submit. Before we've seen button that does like on click, do something locally on the client. Here, we want to submit this form to the server, all right? So the type is submit and the area, the value called area. All right. The first field is called, it's a text, the ID, and then I have a placeholder. Now, if you want to validate this locally using the browser HTML5, what we could use the keyword required, right? When you say required, what it means that this field cannot be blank anymore. If you use other things, like you have different types here, for example, you have range, okay? You have numbers, right? Then you can also specify max and min. So the user will have to enter maximum number and they have to enter a number between max and min. All right. Right now we're leaving it as text field. Okay, but you can still use that in HTML5. You can use max, you can use min, you can use required to make sure that the numbers are correct. I mean, the values that they enter are valid. All right. Okay, so if you run this, if you can save this, now what happens is that if you go to the browser and then refresh this, what happens is that when you click on this, you will get this message: this field is required. Okay, these messages are from the browser because we said it's required field. Okay, now you could customize these messages, and we're going to customize them using our own validation routines. Okay, is that clear? Yeah. So when you see this error, when you click on this, what happens? Actually, the request does not go to the server. Remember when we said action? The action does not go to the server, so it stays in the browser because you have invalid data. All right? Is that clear? All right. So now I don't want to do this required. I'm going to have my own field, my own function to validate. How do we do that? If we go back in here, I'm going to get rid of that required. And I'm going to have my own function to do that. First, to validate using JavaScript and to validate this form, we create a function. So you can say function, and then I'm going to call it validate form. All right. And this is my function. It doesn't receive any parameter. It just validates a form. Okay, what is the purpose of this function? The purpose of this function is to check the fields that you have on the form. If they are valid, we will ask this function to return true. If they are not valid, we ask this function to return false. Okay, this is important. All right. So that's the first step. We create a function. Okay. Now, in the form, the second step you do in the form you do here, you say action, you say on click or on submit. What does this do on submit? Equal, and then we say return, and then you put the name of the function. What is the name of the function that you want to use to validate? This guy, validate form. So again, to minimize errors, I'm going to do control copy, and then here control V. So what does this thing do for me? All is saying that, okay, this is my form. Here's the page that I will go to if everything is valid. But before I go to that page, I want you to call this function to check my data, to make sure that everything is correct. The fact that you're saying return, validate, it means it's going to give you a value back. This value back either true or false. If it's true, means everything is valid and it will let you go to the server. If it is false, it stays on this page in the client side and it will not send data to the server. Is that clear? Yeah. So now in the function, what do we do? In the function, what do? We check. I have three fields in here. First of all, I have this field called the name. The name, it could be, for example, you can check. It has to be, for example, a minimum length, maybe 5 or 3, at least 3 names or 3 letters. Or you can check if it is empty or not, okay? Here you can check if it's a number. Make sure at least they enter a number, all right? Again, this could be done with just using a text field of type number or a range, okay? So you can say here, I want to make sure that they enter a number. You can check, same thing here. You can make sure that they enter a number and it's not empty. All right? So we have these 3 fields that we need to validate. We'll start with the first one. The first one is what? We say, okay, the first thing I need to do is that I need to access those fields. And there's two ways to do it. One way is that you can use the form, or you can use the ID. I'm going to use the ID. So what we're going to do first, we're going to say var for example, owner name equal to what? Equal document dot get element by ID. And then you give it the ID name. What's the ID name? O name. And that value. That will give me the value of that field that whatever the user entered. So this variable will have whatever the user entered on the screen. The next step is that we want to say, do I want it to check, is it empty or not empty? So if it is empty, what do? We say if empty, if oName equal to blank. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that the user did not enter anything in here. Okay? So what do? I would return false. I'm not going to return anything. All right? For now, I'm going to create, just leave it as is. Okay? For now. It means what happens is that if it's empty, means we have an error. So what do we do about this error? You can put an alert message. For example, you can say here alert. We'll remove this in a minute. You can say alert, field name cannot, or owner name cannot be empty. Okay? You can do that, and then you can have to say return false. Okay, don't do this part because I'm going to change it. Okay, we're going to change this part. I'm just showing you what happens. Okay, and I'm going to say here I'm going to return false. Okay, else I'm going to return true. Okay, I'm just showing you this, but it will actually will not make sense in a minute. Okay, return true. I'll make it look better in a minute. All right. So what happens is that this would return false. If the field is empty, it would return false. Otherwise, if it's not empty, it will give me return true. All right. Let's test this and see what happens. If we go to the page here and refresh. Now, if I enter, what should happen? I should have gotten an error, right? I should have gotten that alert, but I didn't get anything. So there's a problem in my code. All right, I'm gonna check it using the debugger again and see where my errors are. Okay, but I'll pause this video for a minute. All right, and we found the mistakes thanks to the help of the students. Actually, we have, was capital, it shouldn't be capital. We have a semicolon here, it was missing. And we have a semicolon that was missing here. Okay, so we fixed that part. Now, if you go to the page, if you go to the browser, this is what happens. So when you don't enter anything, what you do, you get that error message. But that is not really a nice way to present the errors, because the users cannot. If you have many errors, don't like to see these alerts. All right, so we're gonna put that error in here. That's one. And the other thing is that you can have errors in all of these, right? So how do we do this part? All right, so I'm going to hit OK. All right, and then let's go back to our code. All right, I told you that this is not the right way of doing it, so I'm going to change that. Okay, so I'm going to delete all of this. And delete the else, delete all of this, and then do it in a different way. Because you could have multiple errors, we're going to construct a message, an error message. And that error message usually is a string. So how do we do that part? Usually we say, we can say define a var error message, and I'm going to make it empty to start with. And if every time I find an error in my code, I just simply add a message to that, or a message to that error message, to that string. So how do I do this? So I say, usually I say, okay, if it's empty, I can say error message equal, because it's my first error, I say a name cannot be empty. All right? And because I could have more errors, I'm going to put a new line after the message. So I can, when I add another message, that other message will go underneath it. It will not be on the same line. So I'm going to put a break here, page break, not line break. So what happens is that it put that error message and then it skips to the next line. So the next time you add a message, it will go to the next line. It'll go underneath. All right. So that's what we do. Now, what else do I do in here? When we start, this error message is empty. When does it change? Only when you have an error. Only when you have an error. So what I could do after I do my validation, we will add the other two in a minute. What I do, I'd say, I check. If error message is empty, what is not empty, what does that mean if it's not empty? That means it has an error. Because I started blank, the only way that it changes is that I have an error. I can say if it's not empty, it means what? It means, oh, I found an error. An error happened. What do I do if that's the case? Now I return false because there is an error. Else, there is no error. And what do we do if there are no errors? We return true. Got it? So I start with my message. That message is empty. I check my fields to see if there are errors. Every time I find an error, I add to that field. And at the end, after I check all my fields, I check, is the error message still empty? If it's still empty, no error. But if it's not empty in this case, that means I found an error. And then I return false. This is one. But it would be nice to let the user know what are these errors. So we want to display these errors to the user. How do we display these errors to the user? We already have an element called out, right? Out1. So I'm gonna define this element here. We're gonna say var, same thing. I'm gonna copy this guy here. Control copy, control paste. And here, instead of owner name, I'm gonna call this is out. And then output, you can call it output or out, doesn't matter. And no value. All we're getting reference to that field. The value is only used when you're trying to get a value from that field. Since we're not getting any values, it's not an input field, we just say, give me that element on the screen. All right. So what do? If there was an error, I say in here, okay, out.inner HTML equal to what? Equal to the error message. Equal to the error message. So we check the error. If there is error, we create an error message. If there are error, we add to this message. We need to get okay. There's something wrong here, right? What's wrong here? What should this be? Should be the name of the field, which is output1, right? That's the field that we're trying to change. So this should be output1, out1, and if there are error message, I change this field on the screen with the value of the error message, whatever the error message that we created. In this case, it will say name cannot be empty. All right, name cannot be empty. Now let's check it and see what happens. If I save it, and hopefully we don't have errors. So we go in here, and I go in here, refresh. Now if I do this, name cannot be empty, all right? Now if I type in something in here, that error message is not there, and it actually submitted the form, all right? Let me pause it for a minute and answer your questions. All right, so we got this part to work. Couple things we're gonna do with this example. Do you see this here? If it's an error message, if there's an error, actually we wanna make this message look red. All right, so we're gonna change the style of this to red. So how do we change the style of these things in JavaScript? How do we do it? You simply go like this. You can say, we got the element already. That element is called out. So all I have to do, I can just say out.style.color, and then you can put any color you want. In this case, it's red. So you can change the style of an element, any CSS style, using the same technique. So the same thing that you used to do in CSS, you could do it in JavaScript. And the way you do it, you access it, you can change the element name, that style, and then the attribute that you wanted to change. Background color, border, all that stuff you can do in here. All right? So now if you run it, if you save it, and then if you run it, you'll see that the element, if you don't enter anything, what happens is say that element becomes red. Okay? Is that clear? All right. The other thing that we want to do in here, sometimes you want to ask the user to enter a minimum text. So for example, sometimes they say enter a password for registration, and you say the password must be 8-character long, right? How do you make sure the length of the field that they enter is actually meet your requirements? So what you can do here in the same error message, remember when we're saying that we're checking for blank? This checks for blank. They didn't enter anything. What if they actually entered something, 1 letter, 2 letters, 3 letters? But we want it to be actually what? We want it to be 5 long, at least. So what do? You can say if owner name equal blank, or let's say length. You say owner name. Now you can do it differently, and I'm just showing you this function. Length equal to what? Equal or less than, let's say, 5. If it's less than 5, or if it's equal to blank. Now, because the length could be 0 if you don't enter anything, so you won't need this part. But I will leave it so you understand it. Okay. So if the length of the field owner name is less than 5, or it's empty, I want to display this message. Now, this message is not relevant anymore. You have to change that, right? You can just say name has to be at least 5-digit long or 5 characters long. They don't know, at least 5 letters, okay? So name has to be at least 5 letters. So if I do this now, if I go into the page, even though I enter something, if I do refresh, if I enter A, I will still get that error, right? But if I enter anything more than that, I shouldn't get that error anymore. You get that? You get the idea? Yeah. So you can use the length also to validate the length of the characters they enter in your form. All right, now we're done with this name. Let's check the other 2 fields. I'm going to do 1 field, and then I'll let you do the second field, because 1 field is the same as the other one. What do? We would repeat the same steps. I need to get the element again. What is the element? The element now I have called something called width and length. So we're going to do the width first. What I'm going to do before we display the error message, I will check Control copy, Control V. And then I'm going to change. Instead of this, what do we need to change this? Width. Instead of all name, what we're going to change, we're going to say width. Okay? And I'm going to delete this part. And here I'm going to say, again, width. All right. Now, we want to validate, because it's a number, I want to make sure the user actually enters a number. We want to make sure that the user entered the number. How do we check if the user entered a number or not? You can do it this way. So you can say, is not a number, is not a number, and then you put the field name, which is in this case called width. So what does this do? This function does, it checks the value that you entered. Is it a number or not? When we say if it's not a number, that means the user did not enter a number. They entered text value, letters. Or if it is empty. If it's not a number, or if it is empty, it means what? It means that we have an error. What should the error say? It should say the width has to be a valid number. Width has to be a valid number. The only problem with this, you see this is my error message the first time. If we have an error here, and we have an error here, what happens? It replaces whatever you have in there. So what we need to do is that we need to add to it. So if it was empty, we add the error. If we have a message already, we will add to it. So what do? I will say error message plus this message. So error message equal the previous value, whatever the previous value was, plus the new value. All right. Now we can test it and see what happens. If I go to my browser, if I didn't enter anything, I should get 2 errors. For the first one, cannot be empty and the length. And for the second one, that is not a number. So if I do this, I get my 2 errors. So the name has to be at least 5 letters long, and the width has to be a valid number. Now, if I enter a number here, if I put a number in here, and I put, okay, that error gone, disappears. And then I have to fix that error. And if I put something in here, and then those 2 errors will disappear. Is that clear? Let me put it on pause for a minute. All right, I was surprised that this actually worked, because there was another typo in this. There's another typo in this example. This was the length here should have been, we had HT instead of TH, so it should have been TH. All right. So the last bit here is that what you need to do, same thing in with this example. All you do is that you control copy this to complete this example. And what do you do in here? Instead of width, what do we use here? We have length. And again, length in here. And you type in length in here. Same thing in here. And you can say here, if error message, again, the width has to be a valid number. Now, one thing you can do also, you can check if the length is actually negative number, because you cannot have a room that is negative number. So how do you check for that? Or you can say, for example, length is less than 0, less than or equal to 0. Okay, so if it's less than or equal to 0, also I want to display an error message, because you cannot have a negative, length, okay? So if I save this, I'm hoping this should work. Now what you do, for example, if you enter here some values, here it's okay, but I didn't enter anything. So the length has to be a valid number. Even if I enter 0, it has to be a valid number. Notice, if I enter -1, it has to be a valid number. So, or if you put a 1, then it should be okay. All right? So the way you do it, all we added in the last one, you can check if it is a number, if it's not a number, if it's not empty, and if it is not positive number, then I should get an error message. All right? Clear? We are done with this example.